and you're in this foreign land, and you're out in the middle of nowhere in the mountains, and there are trees everywhere, and the darkness is just all encompassing. We still have the comfort of some people being around us, the comfort of, the stagecoach, but where Jonathan is going, he's going alone. He's going to have to leave these people. Hello, I'm Danny, and this is The Dusk Bell. I love gothic horror, I love science fiction, and that's what this channel is dedicated to. And for our inaugural book, we're going to be walking through Bram Stoker's Dracula. My favorite gothic horror novel, many people's favorite gothic horror novel. I've been fascinated by vampires like so many others for so long, and you just don't get any better than Bram Stoker's Dracula in the way of vampires. You really don't. He is the most iconic vampire. This is the most iconic work of vampire fiction, and we're going to go through it together. So I have the Penguin Classics edition here, and that's what we're going to be reading from. And my goal is not to read word for word through the book, but to quote from it and to guide you through it, to summarize certain bits, and to give you my commentary on it as we take this journey together. So whether you're experiencing Dracula for the first time or for the 5,000th time, I'm glad that you're here, and hopefully you can get something out of my channel. We're going to set the scene a bit. So Dracula is released in 1897. So we're towards the end of the 19th century. And what's going on in the 19th century? We're at the height of the British Empire. Our characters in Dracula, our main characters at least, are English. And we have this west to east type of narrative that's going to go on in Dracula. There are a lot of advancements in medicine being made, but there's still a lot that's unknown about medicine. Industry, railroads, telegraphs, so communication, travel. That being said, in the 19th century, a fascination with the supernatural is very prevalent in pop culture and in books and novels, because I think there's this dichotomy of society advancing forward, and so people sort of questioning these advances and maybe retreating a bit to the familiarity of those old legends and myths and fables and superstitions. And so we see that in Dracula. It's a book that's really going to illuminate those two sides of the coin for us at this time period. So Dracula was written by Bram Stoker. He was Irish. He lived in London for most of his adult life. Really, he, to my knowledge, hadn't done something like Dracula before. I'll read you a bit from the preface of the Penguin Classic version. Let's see. The preface was written by Christopher Frayling. On the surface, Bram Stoker was a pillar of late Victorian respectability. A man who was, in the rather patronizing words of one recent critic, a master of the commonplace in most of what he wrote. An ex-clerk in the fines and penalties section, and later the petty sessions office of Dublin Castle, who grew up in the seaside curb of Clontarf, he had become the business manager, box office administrator, and front of house master of ceremonies at the Lyceum Theatre, off the Strand in London. So Bram Stoker was, by all accounts, an upstanding, normal, maybe unassuming member of society at the time. But beneath this glittering surface, Bram Stoker had something gnawing away at his mind. The event which seems to have unlocked his imagination, possibly for the one and only time in his life, leading indirectly to the book which caused everyone who knew him well to say, "I had no idea Stoker had it in him. He was such a feet on the ground sort of person." The event seems to have happened on the night of 7th March, 1890. It was a bad dream, which on 8th March Bram Stoker dutifully jotted down on another piece of Lyceum-headed notepaper. "Young man goes out," he wrote. "Sees girls. One tries to kiss him, not on the lips, but throat. Old Count interferes. Rage and fury diabolical. This man belongs to me. I want him," the Count says. So that was eventually turned into an experience that our character is going to go through, Jonathan Harker. So let's get into it. Dracula by Bram Stoker. So as you may know, Dracula is a novel composed of letters, journal entries, and the like. So we hear from different characters, and we hear from them in different forms of writing. So our first chapter is from the character Jonathan Harker. So Jonathan Harker is a young Englishman, a young attorney. He's traveling to the Carpathians to strike up a deal with a certain Count Dracula, because Count Dracula is seeking to move to England. So our novel begins with Jonathan Harker recounting in his journal his journey thus far. So he's arrived in Bistritz, and he's telling us that he had left Munich at 8:35 p.m., traveled by night. He arrived in Vienna early next morning, and then arrived in Budapest, which he likes. It seems a wonderful place. And one of the first things he says, the impression I had was that we were leaving the West and entering the East, the most western of splendid bridges over the Danube, which is here of noble width and depth, took us among the traditions of Turkish rule. So immediately we have this idea, leaving the West, what Jonathan knows, entering the East, this uncharted territory. He says, we left in pretty good time and came after nightfall to Klausenburg. Here I stopped for a night at the Hotel Royal. He describes a lot about what he eats, which I find interesting. On one hand, it's adding to the detail and our perception of the place and its culture. On the other hand, I wonder if it's kind of evoking, maybe I'm digging too deep, but if it's hinting at these carnal, biological, dietary questions that might come up later in the book. Having some time at my disposal when in London, I had visited the British Museum and made search among the books and maps in library regarding Transylvania. It had struck me that some foreknowledge of the country could hardly fail to have some importance in dealing with the noble of that country. I find that the district he named is in the extreme east of the country, just on the borders of 3 states, Transylvania, Moldavia, and Bukovina, in the midst of the Carpathian Mountains, one of the wildest and least known portions of Europe. So immediately, very early on in the book, we're getting this idea of going into a place wild and unknown. I think with horror, and especially Gothic horror, that really excels about setting the tone and being a slow burn. The beginning of books are so crucial to get us into that feeling and into that atmosphere. When you were a kid, did you ever watch a scary movie and you or any movie really, and there's the setup part of the movie and you kind of are like, okay, come on, let's get into it. Let's get into the good part. I want to get to the scary part. I want to get into the murder and the horror. And I think as we get older, maybe we start to get that appreciation of, if it's done well, the beginning non-horror part of a book can be really compelling because it really lays the groundwork for the rest of the book. So what I love is reading these intro chapters and trying to really find those clues that let us know that things are off or that things are going to become darker. It's so fun. It's really a delightful part of this genre. So he says, I'm in the midst of the he had studied about Transylvania, where he's going, in the midst of the Carpathian Mountains, one of the wildest and least known portions of Europe. I was not able to light on any map or work giving the exact locality of the Castle Dracula, and there are no maps of this country as yet to compare with our own. But I found that Bistritz, the post town named by Count Dracula, is a fairly well-known place. So right now his sense of reference is Bistritz, the city. But in terms of Castle Dracula, it's still a mystery. We still don't really know much about it. Jonathan doesn't know much about it. He's done his homework, but that can only go so far. So he talks about his night in Budapest, and he says, I didn't really sleep well. And immediately, we're already getting into it. So in his hotel, on his travels, he's not sleeping well. And he says, I had all sorts of queer dreams. There was a dog howling all night under my window, which may have had something to do with it. Yeah, I think so, Jonathan. Maybe. It may have been the paprika. It might have been the paprika that he'd eaten earlier. For I had to drink up all the water in my carafe and was still thirsty. So he's thirsty. He's not sleeping well. I can imagine he's maybe hot. I'm burning up right now in this European summer. He says in the early hours of the morning that he would hear knocking at his door and he would sleep and wake up and be confused. And so quite soon, quite immediately, our second page of the book, and Jonathan is not sleeping well. His nights are not going very well, but he still seems in good spirits. What he tells us about his days and his travels, he's interested, he's engaged, but he's not sleeping well. And so this is our first clue that things might not go so smoothly for Jonathan in the future. And then he says, all day long we seemed to dawdle through a country which was full of beauty of every kind. Sometimes we saw little towns or castles on the top of steep hills, such as we see in old missals. Sometimes we ran by rivers and streams, which seemed from the wide stony margin on each side of them to be subject to great floods. It takes a lot of water and running strong to sweep the outside edge of a river clear. At every station there were groups of people, sometimes crowds, and in all sorts of attire. Some of them were just like the peasants at home, or those I saw coming through France and Germany, with short jackets and round hats and homemade trousers, but others were very picturesque. The women looked pretty, except when you got near them, Jonathan says. Okay, Jonathan, great. And so Jonathan is he's in this area that's foreign to him. He's an Englishman. Sometimes you'll see Jonathan has an air of maybe pretentiousness about him, or not pretentiousness, but self-assuredness that only comes with being an English speaker, being a member of the British Empire in this foreign land. But he seems to be interested, and he speaks a bit of German, and he's happy to kind of admire the land and its beauty and the people here, and to use the little German he has to get by. He mentions that it's really useful to him, and that did he not speak it, he doesn't know that he would be able to get by. So even with English being the prevailing language, we're in this area where not many people are going to speak it, so he's relying on his German. Count Dracula had directed me to go to the Golden Crone Hotel, which I found, to my great delight, to be thoroughly old-fashioned. For of course I wanted to see all I could of the ways of the country. I was evidently expected, for when I got near the door I faced a cheery-looking elderly woman in the usual peasant dress, white undergarment with long double apron, front and back, of colored stuff fitting almost too tight for modesty. So the women in this region, even older women, Jonathan thinks are a bit salacious, maybe, a bit tighter fitting clothing than back in England. When I came close, she bowed and said, "The Herr Englishman." "Yes," I said, "Jonathan Harker." She smiled and gave some message to an elderly man in white shirt sleeves who had followed her to the door. He went, but immediately returned with a letter. And now we get our first words from the Count. "My friend, welcome to the Carpathians. I am anxiously expecting you. Sleep well tonight. At 3 tomorrow the diligence will start for Bukovina. A place on it is kept for you. At the Borgo Pass, my carriage will await you and will bring you to me. I trust that your journey from London has been a happy one, and that you will enjoy your stay in my beautiful land. Your friend, Dracula." So Jonathan gets this correspondence from Dracula. He says he found that his landlord had gotten a letter from the Count directing him to secure the best place on the coach for me. But making inquiries as to details, he seemed somewhat reticent and pretended that he could not understand my German. Jonathan says he tries to probe them for more details about Dracula, and unfortunately the man who's hosting him seems a bit hesitant to give more details. So this is the start of Jonathan's going to find it a bit hard to get information about Dracula. People are being a bit reticent, as he says, to give him any more details than what is strictly necessary. He even says, "For it was all very mysterious and not by any means comforting." When I asked him if I knew Count Dracula and could tell me anything of his castle, both he and his wife crossed themselves, and saying they knew nothing at all, simply refused to speak any further. So then it's time for Jonathan to move on. Just before I was leaving, the old lady came up to my room and said in a very hysterical way, "Must you go? Oh, young heir, must you go?" She was in such an excited state that she seemed to have lost her grip of what German she knew, and mixed it all up with some other language which I did not know at all. I was just able to follow her by asking many questions. When I told her that I must go at once and that I was engaged on important business, she asked again, "Do you know what day it is?" I answered that it was the 4th of May. She shook her head again and said, "Oh yes, I know that, but do you know what day it is?" On my saying that I did not understand, she went on, "It is the eve of St. George's Day. Do you not know that tonight, when the clock strikes midnight, all the evil things in the world will have full sway? Do you know where you are going and what you are going to?" She was in such evident distress that I tried to comfort her, but without effect. Finally, she went down on her knees and implored me not to go, at least to wait a day or two before starting. And now we see the Englishman Jonathan emerge. It was all very ridiculous, but I did not feel comfortable. However, there was business to be done, and I could allow nothing to interfere with it. So, Jonathan is he's really beginning. This is the start of where he's really going to start to feel shaken. It's going to take some time, but Jonathan is going to start feeling really uneasy. He is a man of science. He is an Englishman. He is not prone to these ridiculous superstitions, but he will start to be a bit shaken by what's going on. One thing that I've noted here in my book, and that really does help you to immerse yourself, is just simply reminding yourself, in this universe, in the universe of this book, in the world of this book, Jonathan is wrong. Superstitions are not ridiculous, at least not in this case and not in this area of the world. We will come to find that these very superstitious, very hysterical, even natives to the Carpathians are totally vindicated. They're correct. So Jonathan is coming from this world where, sort of our world in real life, outside of the book of Dracula, where superstitions are not really needed. In the world of this novel, they're correct. And so you have to really imagine it's you in Jonathan's place, and you have your life that you have now, and you don't believe in these things. You don't believe in ghosts and superstitious nonsense, but yet everybody around you is, doing the sign of the cross and acting strange and withholding details and begging you not to go, and you shouldn't be going there, and don't you know, this is when all the evil, this day, this St. George's Day, it's when all the evils of the world. I mean, really, how would you react? You would be shaken. It's hilarious because I don't believe in ghosts, but when the lights are out at night, I need my blanket over me for protection. So it's really, if you put yourself in that headspace, it really does start to get unnerving, because you think, I don't know what I'd do if it was really me in my real life, and all these people are insisting that I'm in danger, or that I shouldn't do what I'm doing, because there's this ominous, secretive air about people. Really fascinating head exercise. So Jonathan says that the woman, she rose and dried her eyes, and taking a crucifix from her neck, offered it to me. I did not know what to do, for as an English churchman, I have been taught to regard such things as in some measure idolatrous, and yet it seemed so ungracious to refuse an old lady meaning so well and in such a state of mind. So there you go. He really, maybe that's what you do, you don't want to be rude, but you're also going to hold steadfast to your beliefs. She saw, I suppose, the doubt on my face, for she put the rosary around my neck and said, "For your mother's sake," and went out of the room. So Jonathan moves on. Now he's waiting for a coach that's going to take him to the Borgo Pass, and the Borgo Pass is where Count Dracula said he would send for him. So he says, "Whether it is the old lady's fear, or the many ghostly traditions of this place, or the crucifix itself, I do not know, but I'm not feeling nearly as easy in my mind as usual. If this book should ever reach Mina before I do, let it bring my goodbye. Here comes the coach." So we imagine now, we know that Mina is Jonathan's fiancée, and we're kind of being revealed here that Mina is someone who means something to him. And I find this insane. I find this absolutely insane. He says, "If this book should ever reach Mina before I do, let it bring my goodbye. Here comes the coach." So Jonathan sort of casually is like, right, just in the case that this book is separated from me, get it to Mina. Get it to my fiance. So this is our first indication that Jonathan is really rattled. He's like, right, things might not go well. I might be separated from my book. The book might go home without me. I might not come home. So this is when things are really going to ramp up. When I got on the coach, the driver had not taken his seat, and I saw him talking with the landlady. They were evidently talking of me, for every now and then they looked at me, and some of the people who were sitting on the bench outside the door, which they call by a name meaning word bearer, came and listened, and then looked at me, most of them pityingly. I could hear a lot of words often repeated, queer words, for there were many nationalities in the crowd, so I quietly got my polyglot dictionary from my bag and looked them out. I must say they were not cheering to me, for amongst them were many foreign words, Satan, hell, witch, 2 of them meaning the same thing, one being Slovak and the other Serbian for something that is either werewolf or vampire. Memo. I must ask the Count about these superstitions. Yes, Jonathan, ask the Count. Ask him about the superstitions. When we started, the crowd round the inn door, which had by this time swelled to a considerable size, all made the sign of the cross and pointed 2 fingers toward me. I mean, how freaky is that? You're waiting for the carriage, and then the crowd starts pointing, making the sign of the cross and pointing at you. That's freaky. That's freaky. With some difficulty, I got a fellow passenger to tell me what they meant. He would not answer at first, but on learning that I was English, he explained that it was a charm or guard against the evil eye. This was not very pleasant for me. Just starting for an unknown place to meet an unknown man, but everyone seemed so kind-hearted, and so sorrowful, and so sympathetic that I could not but be touched. So Jonathan, he gets on the coach, and the coach sets off, and he's traveling with many people. I soon lost sight and recollection of ghostly fears and the beauty of the scene as we drove along. Although had I known the language, or rather languages, which my fellow passengers were speaking, I might not have been able to throw them off so easily. Before us lay a green sloping land full of forests and woods, with here and there steep hills, crowned with clumps of trees or with farmhouses, the blank gable end to the road. Truly, he describes the region as beautiful. And if you look at pictures of the Carpathians, here, they're traveling through this Transylvania at the time. What strikes to me is the shade of green. When you look at photos from the Carpathians, it's almost like it's its own shade of green. And the grass, even in parts of the mountains where you don't see thick forest, the grass is really thick and dense. And like Jonathan describes, everything seems jagged and everything is quite angular. Really interesting. So definitely, if you can, look up photos of the Carpathians. It's beautiful. And so you're kind of, you have this, on one hand, Jonathan is admiring this beauty, but as we see, as night falls, as his journey continues, it will remain beautiful, but become very ominous. So they're driving by, he's describing to us the land, and then they advance further in their journey. So he says, beyond the green swelling hills of the middle land rose mighty slopes of forest up to the lofty steeps of the Carpathians themselves. Right and left of us they towered, with the afternoon sun falling upon them and bringing out the glorious colors of this beautiful range. Deep blue and purple in the shadows of the peaks, green and brown where the grass and rock mingled, and an endless perspective of jagged rock and pointed crags, till these were themselves lost in the distance, where the snowy peaks rose grandly. Here and there seemed mighty rifts in the mountains, through which, as the sun began to sink, we saw now and again the white gleam of falling water. One of my companions touched my arm as we swept round the base of a hill and opened up the lofty, snow-covered peak of a mountain, which seemed, as we wound on our serpentine way, to be right before us. "Look, God's seat," and he crossed himself reverently. As we wound on our endless way, and the sun sank lower and lower behind us, the shadows of the evening began to creep round us. So here we're going to get into it. Here night is falling, dusk is falling. This was emphasized by the fact that the snowy mountain top held the sunset and seemed to glow out with a delicate, cool pink. By the roadside were many crosses, and as we swept by, my companions all crossed themselves. Here and there was a peasant man or woman kneeling before a shrine, who did not even turn round as we approached, but seemed in the self-surrender of devotion to have neither eyes nor ears for the outer world. So the journey continues, and as we can see, dusk falls, night begins to fall, and things are going to get a bit more creepy from here on out. As the evening fell, it began to get very cold, and the growing twilight seemed to merge into one dark mistiness, the gloom of the trees, oak, beech, and pine, though in the valleys which ran deep between the spurs of the hills, as we ascended through the pass, the dark firs stood out here and there amongst the background of late-lying snow. Sometimes, as the road was cut through the pine woods that seemed in the darkness to be closing down upon us, great masses of grayness, which here and there bestrewed the trees, produced a peculiarly weird and solemn effect, which carried on the thoughts and grim fancies engendered earlier in the evening, when the falling sunset threw into strange relief the ghost-like clouds which amongst the Carpathians seemed to wind ceaselessly through the valleys. So really, he's advancing, things are getting creepy. Eventually, the passengers in the coach start stirring, talking to each other, whispering, and Jonathan is noticing this feeling. They start to be maybe a bit more awake, a bit more looking about them. And they start talking to the coachman who's driving the carriage. People are, whispering to him, getting his attention, talking to him. And Jonathan says it was as though they were urging him to further speed. He lashed the horses unmercifully with his long whip, and with wild cries of encouragement urged them on to further exertions. So now they're starting to speed up, and people are starting to get anxious. Jonathan sees that ahead of them, there was a cleft in the hills. The excitement of the passengers grew greater. The crazy coach rocked on its leather springs and swayed like a boat tossed on a stormy sea. I had to hold on. The road grew more level, and we appeared to fly along. Then the mountains seemed to come nearer to us on each side and to frown down upon us. We were entering the Borgo Pass, so we're getting closer to where Dracula said he would send for Jonathan. One by one, several of the passengers offered me gifts, which they pressed upon me with an earnestness which would take no denial. These were certainly of an odd and varied kind, but each was given in simple good faith, with a kind word and a blessing. Then, as we flew along, the driver leaned forward, and on each side the passengers, craning over the edge of the coach, peered eagerly into the darkness. So now people are looking out over the side of the carriage, kind of looking into the darkness as we're going through this forest. You can imagine the darkness is creeping in over you. Really, those of you who live in the countryside, you know that at night it gets really dark. If you live in the city, sometimes we forget how dark it gets. In my city where I live, they do this practice where after midnight they turn off the city lights. And every now and then I've been caught outside. I walk my dog and it is dark, and I'm not used to that kind of darkness. So you can imagine, not only is it dark, but here we're in the late 1800s, and you're in this foreign land, and you're out in the middle of nowhere in the mountains, and there are trees everywhere, and the darkness is just all encompassing. We still have the comfort of some people being around us, the comfort of, the stagecoach, but where Jonathan is going, he's going alone. He's going to have to leave these people. So we'll see how he feels about that. It was evident that something was very exciting was either happening or expected, but though I asked each passenger, no one would give me the slightest explanation. This state of excitement kept on for some time. And at last we saw before us the pass opening out on the eastern side. There were dark, rolling clouds overhead, and in the air the heavy, oppressive sense of thunder. It seemed as though the mountain range had separated two atmospheres, and that now we had gotten into the thunderous one. Each moment I expected to see the glare of lamps through the blackness, but all was dark. The only light was the flickering rays of our own lamps, in which the steam from our hard-driven horses rose in a white cloud. We could now see the sandy road lying white before us, but there was on it no sign of a vehicle. The passengers drew back with a sigh of gladness, which seemed to mock my own disappointment. So they get to this convergence where they're in the Borgo Pass, and they get to the place where Dracula is supposed to come find Jonathan, but there's nothing there. There's no vehicle waiting for them there. And everyone around Jonathan seems to be kind of relieved. Thank God there's no one there. Again, he doesn't speak their language, but there's this sense of relief. And Jonathan's, of course, disappointed. He's a young, strapping businessman, and he has business to attend to, and so, he's still expecting something to be there, but people around him are seeming to be, not disappointed that no one's there waiting for him. I was already thinking what I had best do when the driver, looking at his watch, said to the others something which I could hardly hear. It was spoken so quietly and in so low a tone. I thought it was an hour less than the time. Then turning to me, he said in German worse than my own, "There is no carriage here. The heir is not expected after all. He will now come on to Bukovina and return tomorrow or the next day." So the coachman turns to Jonathan and he's like, "Right, no one's here right now. We're early, so we're just going to go ahead. You're going to go ahead with us to Bukovina, and the count will search for you there." So he's trying to hurry things along. He's like, "Right, we got here early. No one's here. Let's bounce," essentially. Then, amongst a chorus of screams from the peasants and a universal crossing of themselves, a caleche with 4 horses drove up behind us, overtook us, and drew up beside the coach. So a caleche being basically a carriage, but I think they're usually lower to the ground and there are fewer seats. So they were associated with the aristocracy and wealth and kind of more stylish travel. And of course, they're more intimate. You're closer to the coach. It's normally only meant to hold, 1, 2, maybe 3 people. I could see from the flash of our lamps as the rays fell on them that the horses were coal black and splendid animals. They were driven by a tall man with a long brown beard and a great black hat, which seemed to hide his face from us. Okay. I could only see the gleam of a pair of bright eyes, which seemed red in the lamplight, as he turned to us. He said to the driver, "You are early tonight, my friend." The man stammered in reply. "The English heir was in a hurry," to which the stranger replied, and this is so good, to which the stranger replied, "That is why, I suppose, you wished him to go on to Bukovina. You cannot deceive me, my friend. I know too much, and my horses are swift." As he spoke, he smiled, and the lamplight fell on a hard-looking mouth, with very red lips and sharp-looking teeth, as white as ivory. Now, also remember, nobody back then is looking like our Hollywood stars of today with veneers. So this white, striking white smile, also especially in the darkness, you can imagine he smiles and there's this white glow from his teeth. So as he spoke to me, he smiled, with very red lips and sharp-looking teeth as white as ivory. And now we get a really iconic moment in the book. One of my companions whispered to another the line from Burger's Lenore. Denn die Toten reiten schnell, for the dead travel fast. The strange driver evidently heard the words, for he looked up with a gleaming smile. The passenger turned his face away, at the same time putting out his 2 fingers and crossing himself. Give me the heir's luggage, said the driver, and with exceeding alacrity my bags were handed out and put in the caleche. Then I descended from the side of the coach, as the caleche was close alongside. Let's pause. How good was that? How good was that? For the dead travel fast. I love it. And I love how when the passenger in the coach said this, whispered this to someone else, the stranger in the caleche smiled at it. He seemed to like it. He seemed to relish in that. For the dead travel fast. So Jonathan gets out from the coach. His bags are put in the caleche. And he says, as the caleche was close alongside, the driver helped me with the hand which caught my arm in a grip of steel. His strength must have been prodigious. Without a word, he shook his reins, the horses turned, and we swept into the darkness of the pass. As I looked back, I saw the steam from the horses of the coach by the light of the lamps, and projected against it the figures of my late companions, crossing themselves. So gosh, this whole journey they've just been crossing themselves, pointing at Jonathan, really eerie. And then you can imagine, he's in this caleche with this mysterious driver. It's probably getting darker by the second as he goes, through the Borgo Pass, and he's looking back at the coach that he had shared with all those people, and they're disappearing, and their lamplight is disappearing. Woof. As they sank into the darkness, I felt a strange chill, and a lonely feeling came over me. But a cloak was thrown over my shoulders and a rug across my knees, and the driver said in excellent German, "The night is chill, mein Herr, and my master the Count bade me take all care of you. There is a flask of plum brandy underneath the seat, if you should require it." Jonathan doesn't end up drinking this. He says in any other situation he would, but seeing as he's attending to business, as he's a bit on edge, he doesn't think that this is going to help his situation. It seemed to me that we were simply going over and over the same ground again, and so I took note of some salient point and found that this was so. So Jonathan, he has the feeling that they're going in circles, and so he finds a landmark, and it verifies that yes, they're going in circles. And so we can imagine that it takes a bit of time for Jonathan to figure out. I mean, really the horror of that. You don't know where you are. You can barely see anything. You haven't really fully seen this coachman's face. You're in the pitch black, in the middle of the forest, in the middle of nowhere. It's just you and this person. And then you figure out that you're going in circles. I mean, come on. I would have liked to have asked the driver what this all meant. But I really feared to do so, for I thought that, placed as I was, any protest would have had no effect in case that there had been an intention to delay. By and by, however, as I was curious to know how the time was passing, I struck a match, and by its flame looked at my watch. It was within a few minutes of midnight. This gave me a sort of shock, for I suppose the general superstition about midnight was increased by my recent experiences. I waited with a sick feeling of suspense. So Jonathan sees it's midnight, and by this point we know this stuff has really gotten to him, as it would get to anybody. It's scary, These people have been really, over the top, expressing to him their superstition and their worry for him. And, now when he happens to check the time, he sees that the driver, for some reason, is delaying. They're in the middle of nowhere, these encroaching, oppressive woods, darkness around him. Really, you can imagine almost pitch black around him. And he checks his watch, and it's midnight. Then a dog began to howl somewhere in a farmhouse far down the road, a long, agonized wailing, as if from fear. The sound was taken up by another dog, and then another and another, till borne on the wind, which now sighed softly through the pass, a wild howling began, which seemed to come from all over the country, as far as the imagination could grasp it through the gloom of the night. At the first howl, the horses began to strain and rear, but the driver spoke to them soothingly. and they quieted down, but shivered and sweated as though after a runaway from sudden fright. Then, far off in the distance, from the mountains on each side of us, began a louder and a sharper howling, that of wolves, which affected both the horses and myself in the same way. For I was minded to jump from the caleche and run, whilst they reared and plunged madly, so that the driver had to use all of his great strength to keep them from bolting. In a few minutes, however, my own ears got accustomed to the sound, and the horses so far became quiet that the driver was able to descend and to stand before them. He petted and soothed them, and whispered something in their ears, as I have heard of horse tamers doing, and with extraordinary effect, for under his caresses they became quite manageable again, though they still trembled. The driver again took his seat, and shaking his reins, started off at a great pace. This time, after going to the far side of the pass, he suddenly turned on a narrow road which ran sharply to the right. So finally, Jonathan has escaped, going in circles with this coachman, and finally he takes a path they haven't gone down before. And basically, John says the wind starts whipping, the dogs, you can imagine just all these dogs howling around him. Wolves, he said, they had become. The baying of the wolves sounded nearer and nearer, as though they were closing round on us from every side. And then Jonathan says, I grew dreadfully afraid, and the horses shared my fear, but the driver was not in the least disturbed. He kept turning his head from left to right, but I could not see anything through the darkness. So this next part is really interesting. If you've seen Francis Ford Coppola's version of Dracula, he includes this part. Most movies based on Dracula opt to cut this out, but it's fascinating. And we do get a bit more explanation about it in later chapters. But here we go. Suddenly, away on our left, I saw a faint flickering blue flame. So he's in this caleche, and then imagine this. He's pitch black forest, and through the trees you see a blue flame. Now maybe Jonathan had seen something like this, on a gas top stove, but where else would you see something like that? I mean, really imagine you're in the middle of nowhere and you see a blue flame in the middle of the woods. It sent shivers up my spine, and I love it. So we continue. The driver saw it at the same moment. He at once checked the horses and, jumping to the ground, disappeared into the darkness. I didn't know what to do. So the driver just ups and leaves. I didn't know what to do. The less as the howling of the wolves grew closer. So the driver ups and leaves, and this sound of wolves, they're, like Jonathan said, they had been circling them, getting closer, and now they're really close. But while I wondered, the driver suddenly appeared again, and without a word took his seat, and we resumed our journey. I think I must have fallen asleep and kept dreaming of the incident, for it seemed to be repeated endlessly, and now looking back, it's like a sort of awful nightmare. Once the flame appeared so near the road that even in the darkness around us I could watch the driver's motions. He went rapidly to where the blue flame arose. It must have been very faint, for it did not seem to illuminate the place around it at all, and gathering a few stones, formed them into some device. Once there appeared a strange optical effect. When he stood between me and the flame, he did not obstruct it, for I could see its ghostly figure all the same. So the driver, getting off the carriage, going to this blue flame, doing something with stones around the blue flame. And then for a split instant, Jonathan sees the driver in front of the flames, but it's like he's translucent, and you can see through the driver and still see the flame. But then, of course, Jonathan convinces himself that it's a trick of his eye. It's an optical illusion. It's dark. There's this flame. I could see myself convincing myself that it was an optical illusion. So then for a time, so they continue on. The driver gets back in the caleche and they continue on. And then for a time, there were no blue flames, and we sped onwards through the gloom with the howling of the wolves around us as though they were following in a moving circle. So we can't really escape. It's almost like the wolves are escorting them somewhere, or, guarding this circle in which Jonathan finds himself. So at last there came a time when the driver went further afield than he had yet gone, and during his absence the horses began to tremble worse than ever and to snort and scream with fright. I could not see any cause for it, for the howling of the wolves had ceased altogether. So the driver leaves again, presumably to go pursue one of these blue flames, or just to, do some business. I suppose Jonathan, like Jonathan said, he's not really going to ask the driver about this because he is sort of helpless in this situation. It wouldn't make much of a difference, if he asked the driver, well, what are we doing? Where are you going? And also you can imagine, Jonathan, he makes reference to this feeling of feeling a bit paralyzed with fear. So he's really not going to do anything about this. He's kind of dealing with his own feelings and this strangeness of this night and this carriage ride. And so like we've said, we can hear these wolves circling them, and Jonathan's gotten used to that. And then imagine all of a sudden the wolves, the sounds of them start growing distant. And so you sort of think that they're growing distant. And then the carriage stops. And then the horses start to act weird. And so Jonathan's saying, he's like, well, the wolves are gone. They've stopped howling. They're not near us. So now why are the horses acting so frightful? He said they began to tremble worse than ever and to snort and scream with fright. I could not see any cause for it, for the howling of the wolves had ceased altogether. But just then the moon, sailing through the black clouds, appeared behind the jagged crest of a beetling pine-clad rock. And by its light I saw around us a ring of wolves, with white teeth and lolling red tongues, with long sinewy limbs and shaggy hair. They were 100 times more terrible in the grim silence which held them than ever when they howled. For myself, here's that paralysis. I felt a sort of paralysis of fear. It is only when a man feels himself face to face with such horrors that he can understand their true import. How terrifying. So he thought the wolves were gone. And then when the moon comes out, by the moonlight, he realizes that they're actually right there, and they're circling the carriage, and the horses are neighing and going crazy and snorting and are terrified. All at once the wolves began to howl as though the moonlight had had some peculiar effect on them. The horses jumped about and reared, and looked helplessly round with eyes that rolled in a painful way to see, but the living ring of terror encompassed them on every side, and they had perforce to remain within it. I called to the coachman to come, for it seemed to me that our only chance was to try to break out through the ring and to aid his approach. I shouted and beat the side of the caleche, hoping but the noise to scare the wolves from that side, so as to give him a chance of reaching the trap. How he came I know not, but I heard his voice raised in a tone of imperious command, and looked towards the sound, saw him stand in the roadway. As he swept his long arms, and through brushing aside some impalpable obstacle, the wolves fell back and back further still. Just then a heavy cloud passed along the face of the moon, so that we were again in darkness. When I could see again, the driver was climbing into the caleche, and the wolves had disappeared. This was also strange and uncanny that a dreadful fear came upon me, and I was afraid to speak or move. The time seemed interminable as we swept on our way, now almost in complete darkness, for the rolling clouds obscured the moon. We kept on ascending, with occasional periods of quick descent, but in the main always ascending. Suddenly I became conscious of the fact that the driver was in the act of pulling up the horses. So Jonathan says that they keep ascending these mountains. Their journey continues. The driver has somehow banished the wolves. And then Jonathan realized that they have pulled into the courtyard of a vast, ruined castle, from whose tall black windows came no ray of light. So I think you can imagine that he even has trouble making out this castle. He says it. He said, suddenly I became conscious of the fact. So really it's not that he sees a castle in the distance, that they're almost there. It's just that in this blackness of night, finally he makes out that they've arrived at this castle, and there's no light coming from it whatsoever. He said, from whose tall black windows came no light, and whose broken battlements showed a jagged line against the moonlit sky. And thus ends chapter 1 of Dracula. I'm going to get you chapter 2 next week. definitely let me know your comments. Have you read Dracula before? Have you not read Dracula before? How long has it been? What do you think of this first chapter in terms of really setting up a horror novel, a gothic horror novel that really plays on that sense of dread and fear within us and anticipation within us of wicked things to come? How does this first chapter do? Were there any details you noticed that you hadn't noticed before? I would love to hear your comments and your feedback, and I cannot wait to really get into this book and to explore it more and to finish it with you. We have, the recent movie that came out last year, The Voyage of the Demeter. That chapter is going to come up and we can explore that chapter together. So, the dusk bell tolled. We came. We went through the first chapter of Dracula, and now it's night. Again, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I will see you guys next time.